One thing I've noticed, especially in smaller churches or organizations, is that the need for leaders is so great that often anyone who can fog a mirror is qualified. That can be a very serious mistake. I've seen the results on boards and councils where the only qualification was willingness to serve. Even though the intent might be good, the long term result won't be. And I think that's why Paul is laying out these qualifications. Leaders are expected to have a track record in which they have demonstrated not only their faithfulness, but their behavior. No one can be above reproach without having a consistent witness. Faithful to his wife isn't something that's visible on a return from the honeymoon. Temperate, self controlled, respectable. You get the idea. These attributes are demonstrated over time. I've also been in situations where recent converts have been put into a position that they are just not ready for. I was first on a core council at Peterborough Temple when I was about 17 because I was the leader of the youth group and they wanted the input of a young person. Even though I had been a believer for many years and grew up in a solid Christian family, I wasn't ready. But I did learn a lot. Hearing a different perspective is a good idea, but having that person in leadership? Probably not. I like the idea of hearing from someone who isn't part of the church, as their viewpoint can be truly valuable. I know a church planter who brought his non-Christian brother with him to plant a church in Redmond, Washington. When the unbelieving brother asked why, he said it was because he was the kind of person the new church wanted to reach. I get that. So what can happen if someone has recently become a believer and you see a lot of potential there? Well, involve that person in ministry where they can grow, learn, and develop. Watch for an increasing Christ-likeness and the development of leadership skills and abilities. Involve them in forums and training events. Do everything to help them to stir up the gift that is in them. 2 Timothy 1:6. Involve them in Bible studies, encourage them to share their faith, and to seize opportunities to gather with faithful believers. Think of them as future leaders, and when they're ready, you have a strong bench to draw from. And then Paul adds a pretty significant warning. He may become conceited and fall under the same judgment as the devil. Paul says to the church in Rome, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment in accordance with the faith God has distributed to each of you. Chapter 12, verse 3. In November 1978, I was called by God to go into full-time ministry as a pastor with the Salvation Army. In May 1979, Elsie and I attended the candidate seminar in Toronto, a 3-day event where we would be exposed to many aspects of training and officership in the Salvation Army. I knew there was a tremendous need for leaders, and to be honest, I was thinking that God was being truly blessed because I said yes. On the Saturday evening, we went with a number of officers, cadets, and candidates to conduct an open-air meeting at the corner of Dundas and Jarvis Streets in a parking lot across from the Warwick Hotel, which was notorious as a whorehouse. The streets were crawling with partiers, drunks, and hookers. As we set up and began to sing, pray, preach, and testify, several of the people would go off 2 by 2 to have conversations with people who were on the periphery. One woman approached Elsie, and off they went together. And I stood there and prayed, Lord, please don't let anyone invite me to go with them. And my prayer was answered. A few minutes later, the cadet who was holding the Salvation Army flag signaled to me for him to come to where he was standing. With a lump in my throat, I went, not knowing what to expect. He said, Phil, would you please hold the flag? I see someone I want to go and talk to. Phew! Of course, I said yes, and then I had an obligation to not go and talk to anyone. I couldn't let the team down now, so I stood there looking quite proud, I'm sure, of holding the flag as straight as it had ever been. And I was shaken. I realized that I could not do what God was calling me to do. I could not witness to people that I didn't know. I could not talk with people who were from parts of society which were as far away from my experience as I could imagine. I could not do this in my own strength. I would fail if I did this on my own. I also knew that with Christ all things are possible. Philippians 4:13. That night I prayed a prayer of confession for ever thinking that I could do this by myself. I prayed a prayer of thanksgiving that God had called me and that He had provided to be my strength where I am weak. And I prayed a prayer of dedication, a renewal to follow wherever He leads, going in the strength of the Lord. Otherwise, I was doomed to fail. Such is the temptation to anyone to think more highly of themselves than they ought, and to try to do any level of worthwhile ministry in their own strength. Jesus said, "No one who puts his hand to the plow and looks back is fit for service in the kingdom of God." Luke 9:62. If you're going to accept God's call to leadership, give it all you've got in the strength of the Lord.